So you want to start a podcast. Love that for you. I'm going to need you to watch this video first because I've had a podcast for a few years now and oh my God, are there some things that I wish I knew when I was starting my journey. I'm going to dive into all of those things today and I'm not going to hold back. By the way, this video is sponsored by Riverside, more on them later. All right, let's talk about one of the most important elements of your podcast, which is going to be how you're recording and editing your podcast. Now, I don't feel like I have to explain why this is one of the most important parts, right? If you're not recording and editing your podcast properly, then you're not going to have any content. But also, if you're not utilizing the right tools to do this, then you're probably going to make the entire process longer, more expensive, and genuinely lower quality. I know this because that's pretty much what happened when I first started my journey. I wasn't using the right recording software and my audio wasn't as good as it could be, but don't worry, I suffered through it so that you don't have to. So, podcasts are, of course, audio format. Even if you have a video element, the most important part of your podcast is that you have strong audio. One of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people make, especially if they are interviewing people as part of their podcast, is they will use like meeting software in order to facilitate that interview. They think like,
of course, we'll just use the normal software that I use for my meetings. We'll make sure that my microphone's selected. I'll be able to see the person. Job's done. Bob's your uncle.
No. What ends up happening is that your recording kind of goes down the pan because your internet connection might not have been great. So maybe there's buffering in between different questions and your guest is speaking over you and you're speaking over them and your guest's audio isn't great because maybe they're not a podcaster or a content creator. Their audio sounds like they're speaking to you through a crackled phone whilst your audio sounds like crisp because you've got a proper mic. All in all, the recording experience won't be good, but also the output won't be good either. As I said, I made some of these mistakes in the early days of my podcast, and a few months in, I found Riverside and I started to record my episodes using their platform, and that really is when everything changed for me. If you're not familiar with Riverside, it's essentially a virtual studio which allows you to record and edit your content with ease and also to a really, really high quality and standard. Let's break down a few of the tools that you are going to want to use when you are recording your podcast episodes. So first things first, when you sign up to Riverside, which by the way, you can do using the link in my description, and you can get 15% off if you use my code JadeBeeson. Plug. When you join Riverside, it's worth noting that in addition to being able to actually record your episodes using Riverside, you can also upload pre-recorded content and edit it using Riverside too. So let's say we're going to record an episode. You can click the Go to Studio button or you can plan a recording in advance. Let's click on Go to Studio. Let's make sure that the right camera and audio is being picked up. Amazing. Click Join Studio, and then there we are at this lovely, lovely flattering angle. Now, on the right here, you can see there's a space for your guests to join, and they can either join by you sharing this link with them, or you can invite them by email. So once you've done either of those things, their beautiful face will appear on the screen with you, okay? So there's a few different tools that you can use when it comes to recording your episodes. For starters, on the right, you're gonna see a list of all the people who are on your call, and you can do things like mute them, turn on echo cancellation, noise reduction, etc., just to make sure that the audio is really crisp. You can also upload a script to make it easier for you to remember what you're supposed to be saying at the episode. And you can turn this script into a teleprompter for you to use when you're recording too. Once you're ready to record, you might want to run a quick test recording just to make sure that the audio and the visual are good. And then once you're ready, you click the start recording button, you'll get a lovely countdown, and then you're on air. Now, once you're done with recording your podcast episodes, there are a few tools that you're going to want to use to enhance the entire process for you. So let's click on a previous edit so you can see an example. I'm going to click on this little edit button here. First one, since we're talking about your podcast, is going to be a tool that allows you to enhance the audio quality. So we're going to click on AI Producer, click on Magic Audio and click Apply, and it's going to magically, hence the name, improve and enhance the quality of your audio. Very, very important for a podcast. We're also going to use the other AI tools. So another one we want to use is Smooth Speech, which is going to remove all of the filler words from your content. So if you have a habit of saying and R or and or like or anything like that, like I do, then you can click this button and it's going to remove all of those filler words for you. And then of course you've got the set pace feature, which is one of my favorites. It allows you to change the pacing of your episode so that it's either fast, which basically means there aren't that many pauses in it, or that it's the normal version, so leaving all the pauses in there. This just makes editing so much quicker. So instead of you having to just go through and select every space and delete it every single time there is one, you can just use this feature here, click apply, and it's going to do it for you. Another essential feature to pay attention here is the AI show notes feature. You're already going to get a transcript for any content that you either record or upload into Riverside. But if you click generate show notes, it's going to take it one step further and actually create show notes for that episode. So here you can see it's created a summary of the episode, keywords, takeaways, titles, even sound bites, which I think is so useful for you to use when you're promoting that video on your other social channels, and of course chapters as well. well. So there really is no excuse for you to have good show notes under your podcast episodes because Riverside is literally creating them for you. I am really not exaggerating when I say that if you are creating a podcast, then you need to be using Riverside. Of course, I've got a link to Riverside in the description and you can get 15% off if you use my code Jade Beeson. All right, so the next thing that you need to know about the world of podcasting is that your podcast name is so important. It's so important. It's more important than your YouTube name or your Instagram name or anything like that. Your podcast name is so important, and here is why. Your podcast name could be the difference between thousands of people finding your podcast and no one finding your podcast. The thing to remember about podcasting is that it is very different from social media in the sense that there is no algorithm, there is no search engine powering podcasts, which means that when you upload a podcast episode, there is no system working in the background to try and push that podcast episode out to the right listeners. That is not happening. You have to do that yourself. One of the ways that you can cheat the system is by choosing a podcast name that people are going to search for. That way, if people do search for that podcast, you are likely to appear. That is the reason why I renamed my podcast, to make sure that it has the word creator in it and to make sure that it had my name in it. Because I was getting a lot of messages from people saying like, I didn't know you had a podcast. I actually searched your name once because you mentioned a podcast and I can't find it, right? So I added Jade Beeson to my podcast name so that when people are searching for it, I'm more likely to appear. For you, it might be that there's a very, very obvious keyword that you should have in your podcast name. If your podcast is all about interior design, which would be a really, really difficult podcast topic because that's such a visual example, but you get the drift, right? If your podcast was about interior design, then you probably want to have the words interior design in it. So that when people are searching for it, it appears, right? So don't sleep on your podcast name. This brings me on to the next point, which is that your podcast will not market itself. And I wish this was not the case, but guys, it's not going to market itself. So you remember what I just said about the fact that there's no algorithm, there's no search engine powering your podcast, which basically means that you can create all these episodes and publish them. And if your podcast name isn't searchable, or if you're not promoting the podcast elsewhere, no one might ever hear your episodes. No one might ever come across your incredible content. Podcasts do not market themselves, okay? Which means you need to come up with a marketing plan. Now, in order for you to market your podcast effectively, you need to pick at least one marketing channel for you to talk about your podcast. So that might be social media. Maybe you want to create TikToks, Instagrams, YouTube content, etc. to help you get your word out about your podcast. Or it might be utilizing an existing channel that you have. Like maybe you have an email list that you can use to promote your podcast. Maybe you have a blog. Maybe you have connections with other creators or podcasters or business owners, and you can use their channels to promote your podcast. Maybe you can feature on their podcast to talk about your podcast. How many times can I say the word podcast in one episode? Or maybe you've got some money. Congrats. I love that for you. Maybe you've got some cash money, you've got some money in the bank, and therefore you want to explore things like podcast ads. Whichever channel you pick, research it and get started. The sooner you get started marketing your podcast using these channels, the quicker you learn what's working and what's not working, and the quicker you get to the point where your podcast is thriving thanks to your marketing efforts. Another thing that you need to know about the world of podcasting is that you need to get ahead. What I'm talking about here is specifically getting ahead of your posting schedule. Now, for some podcasts, this is really difficult. If you have a podcast which is incredibly topical, like you're only talking about the things that happen that day or that week, you are going to struggle to get ahead of your posting schedule. But it's not impossible to get ahead of your schedule. What all podcasters need to do is have some form of content which is evergreen. This is basically content which is relevant regardless of the time when your audience are consuming it. So it's not seasonal and it's not heavily topical. We all need to have some form of evergreen content, because when you have evergreen content, you're able to create it in advance and schedule it to go out in the future. This allows you to do things like take sick days, go on holiday, celebrate Christmas. Like you could do things like celebrate different holiday seasons with your family and not have to worry about recording your next podcast episode because you have evergreen content that is going out without you having to lift a finger. Final thing to know, and I hate to end on a slightly negative note, but podcasts are not a get rich quick scheme, my love. That is not what they are.
Sorry to disappoint.
Oh, I wish it was different. I wish it was, but it's just the case. You're not going to get rich yet. You might at some point from your podcast, but it's probably not going to be straight away. And that's okay. I think once we're aware of that, it makes the whole process a lot more enjoyable. The reason why you're probably not going to get rich straight away is because the main way to earn money for your podcast is to treat it like a media company, which basically means that you sell advertising slots in and around your podcast. Like that is usually the main way that people make an income from their podcast. Now, unless you have thousands and thousands of people downloading every single podcast episode that you share, you're probably going to struggle to get advertisers in the beginning. That's okay. It doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It also doesn't mean that your podcast isn't successful. It just means that you've not monetized it yet. And as I said, that's fine. It might be worth thinking about the role that your podcast plays in your overall business. For example, I've never monetized my podcast in the sense that I am being paid by other brands to advertise their products during my podcast. I don't do that, but I do advertise my own products and services in my podcast. So when it comes to my overall business, my podcast actually does contribute to my bottom line. It does contribute to my income. And that's what's made it easier for me to keep it going for a couple of years. So think about how your podcast feeds in or sits amongst the broader space of your business or your content creation career. Okay, guys, those are the main things that you need to know before you get going with your podcast. I wish you all of the luck in the world. Feel free to share a link to your podcast in the description. I've not done something like that in a while. Drop a link to your podcast in the description so that we can all check it out. Tell us what it's about so that we know if it's of interest, so you can check it out and we can support each other. That idea. I should do this more often. Don't forget that you can get started with Riverside using the link in my description, and you can get 15% off your individual plans when you use code Jade Beeson. If you feel like hanging around, I recommend watching this video. It's all about how you can create a basic social media strategy from scratch. Very important video to watch if you do decide that you are going to market your podcast using social media. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I cannot wait to see you in my next video.